All right, so here we go. We're going to focus on our new unit, last unit, Unit 15, the entrance into modern times. So we're going to have three questions. One, we're going to deal with the 80s, and we're going to talk about kind of a transition into the modern era in terms of foreign policy. And then we're going to look at some presidential elections and kind of show how that a lot of the ideas and platforms and key debate points in those elections helped us to learn a little bit about modern times. So we're going to do the 1980s kind of like we did the last unit, the 50s and 60s and the 70s. We're going to break it up into politics, foreign policy, society, government, economics, etc. So let's talk about the 1980s. Were the 1980s truly morning in America? In the 84 re-election attempt by Ronald Reagan, there's a famous commercial which we'll talk about a little bit, in which he referred to it as morning in America. In other words, the sun's coming up, everything's good. Reagan for president. Let's make America great again. Wow, does that sound familiar? I think I heard that somewhere before. Oh, yeah. Another famous Hollywood-esque president from the outside who used this expression to get people who are kind of on the outside tired of some of the noise and the problems connected to his political campaign. Think of the 80s in one way. So if the 60s were the time of protest and America kind of got off the rails a little bit and things got a little shaky between Vietnam and civil rights and the gay rights movement and feminism and the birth of the conservation movement, and then we're moving into Watergate. Just, all of these problems of the 60s led to the hangover of the 70s. Our economy went kaput, stagflation, and we have all these political problems and social issues, etc. Well, the 80s could maybe be the antidote. If the 70s were the hangover, the 80s are, the wake-up call. And the 80s were, in some ways, a good time in America in terms of the economy, in terms of some balancing out in society, but some hidden undertones will be revealed. Some groups that have been marginalized. So let's break it down. All right, politics. Nobody defines the 80s more than Ronald Reagan. When you think about Reagan, the first thing to recognize is he was straight out of central casting. He was this charismatic Hollywood actor, famous for the movies down here, Bedtime with Bonzo, and that's him as the Gipper, the famous Notre Dame hero who died, and his last wish in his deathbed was to tell the boys one day to go out there and win one for the Gipper. Well, if you notice, it's a relatively close election. You see there's a third party in there, but electoral vote, it's a crushing win. It's a narrow political or popular vote, but electorally, it's a huge win for Reagan. And his political background, he was a governor of California, and he wasn't that for very long. I mean, look at his laissez-faire quote here. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. This is a president who's going to deregulate, who's going to take his hands off. Think about Hoover or Harding Coolidge Hoover, right before the Great Depression. He is going to be a hands-free president in terms of domestic policy. If you have a chance, go to history.com, just type in history.com, and type in Morning in America and watch that video. It does a great job of helping you see, first, how good Reagan was with the camera, and second, just kind of how people felt better about things during his time. Well, Reagan serves 2 terms, reelected easily, and when it's his turn to walk out the door, he goes coattails and hands off the keys to George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. That's the father of the George W. Bush that you might be a little more familiar with. George H.W. Bush was a war hero. He was a dive bomber pilot or torpedo, I can't remember all of a sudden, but he was in the Pacific, very, very heroic acts, definitely waved the bloody shirt. And because of Reagan's popularity, he was able to win election relatively easily. There's a couple other good commercials. So down here on the bottom, you see this guy, Michael Dukakis. He was the governor of Massachusetts. And whereas he had some very good ideas, etc., he didn't carry over so well on TV. And there's this one video, you could go to history.com and look up Tank Ride. It's one of the worst presidential commercials ever, and it's because the Republicans stole it from the Democrats. So, here's Bush being reelected on the coattails. Um, Very, very qualified. He'd been the ambassador to China, was the director of the CIA. Um, Dukakis was also beat by a political commercial. This is a guy by the name of, oh shucks, just lost his name, um, Willie Horton. And Willie Horton had gotten out of prison on parole. Basically, the prisons were getting crowded, so Dukakis and the government decided to let people out on weekends. Well, Willie Horton went and found a couple and did very, very bad things to them over the course of a weekend and was reelected. And that made Dukakis seem, and here is the political killer phrase, soft on crime. To be labeled soft on crime is to basically mean you're not going to win an election. So George H.W. Bush was able to win relatively easily. Foreign policy. Of course, when you talk about Ronald Reagan, nothing more so than winning the Cold War. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He called him the evil empire, and he outspent him and he beat him. He kind of called his shot. But he's also famous. I don't know if you remember, we talked about the Iran-Contra affair, which was the time when we sold guns illegally to Iran to take the money and give it illegally to the Contras, who are fighting communist-backed Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And so this was all illegal, and it was all during Reagan's presidency, and he claimed not to know a darn thing about it. In Latin America, remember we talked about Manuel Noriega, Panama's dictator, and the war on drugs. We actually sent the Marines in there and arrested him, deposed him, took him straight off the throne, so to speak. Which, when you think about Pancho Villa in Mexico in the early 1900s with Woodrow Wilson and us trying to figure out what was going on in Mexico, and we couldn't solve anything, and here we just send in the troops and took the guy right off the throne. It's kind of the second time we've asserted ourselves in Panama. Remember the first Panamanian Revolution to get the Panama Canal? You also might have heard about South African leader Nelson Mandela, kind of a Martin Luther King's sort of figure. He went through his own civil rights movement. In South Africa, they referred to it as apartheid, keeping the races apart. And that was policy. And during the 80s, he had been in prison for a long, long time, was finally released, and they led a very powerful anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. I can remember that there was a movie out during this time period with Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. It was a series called Lethal Weapon. Basically cops running around blowing stuff up, car chases, just craziness. Well, one of them, they basically centered on South African apartheid. And the bad guys weren't just drug runners or, bank robbers or kidnappers. They were South African kidnappers, bank robbers, and drug runners. And since they were South African, they were bad, bad, bad. There was a song that was out when I was a kid called Free, Free Nelson Mandela. And that was basically the chorus. I just sang it over and over again. George Bush, H.W. Bush, a little bit more unfamiliar territory. Probably the most important foreign affair was Desert Storm, also called the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Saddam Hussein, who you may or may not remember, was the direct dictator of Iraq. And in Iraq, he invaded and took over tiny little Kuwait, kind of like Germany beating up on Belgium. And George H.W. Bush went on TV and said, listen, buddy, either you get out of Kuwait or we're going to get a coalition together and we're going to kick your butt. And I could totally remember as the time ticked down to midnight on, I don't remember the day, but sometime in October, I think, it was, if you didn't get out, we're going to unleash the hounds. And he didn't get out, and we unleashed the hounds. And we blitzed ever-living fire out of the Iraqi Republican Army, which was a pretty good army. They'd just been in a war with Iran for the past few years. They were pretty battle-trained and knew what they were doing, and you could see all the destroyed tanks. This was definitely one of those wars where technology made the difference. We had smart missiles, missiles that could be guided by lasers. So we're blowing up tanks, and they never even saw us coming. The Iraqis would get over here and lob missiles and shoot missiles at the American troops in and around Kuwait, and in and around Israel, in and around Saudi Arabia. But we had something called Patriot missiles. So they would shoot their Scuds in the air, and we would shoot Patriot missiles that would knock their missiles out of the air. And that's technology, winner right there. Two famous faces you see here Colin Powell, first black man to be the leader of the Chiefs of Staff. Basically means he was the only person more important than him in the Army was the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. So that was a very powerful honor. He ends up later on becoming the Secretary of State during presidencies of George W. Bush, and quite possibly could have run for president and been the first black president before Obama even. And sitting next to him is a rock star, Norman Schwarzkopf, called Stormin' Norman. And he used to come on TV and give these updates, and it almost felt like Sports Center. You know, he'd get up there, yeah, we had these guys on the run, and we just, you know, took them to the left. And it's just very entertaining TV. But because we kicked Iraq butt so easily, it's almost like we finally got rid of the stigma of losing Vietnam. You know, it's kind of our first win after that loss. Another big episode during Bush's presidency was in China. Lots of student protest, and you see this very iconic photo. This is just a man with his groceries who has stopped a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square. You know, ever curious, just look up Tank Man in Tiananmen Square. Very interesting story. Just stepped out, the tank stopped moving, and the protesters are going crazy and yelling and screaming, and the tanks try and drive around him, and he moves, and at one point he jumps on top of the tanks and starts beating on the door, and he's like, go away, go away. And nobody knows what happened to Tank Man. At one point, some of his friends came running out of the crowd, grabbed him, and took him away, kind of like, all right, you made your point. If you don't move, you're gonna be roadkill. And no one knows if he was ever captured or imprisoned, or he just kind of disappeared for good or for bad. But we have some real interesting relationships with China. You know, think about the open door policy with spheres of influence led by Secretary of State Hay in the age of imperialism. You know, we had our issue with who lost China during the communistic revolution of 1949. And we still have issues with China today, as you can tell, sitting at home, worried about a virus that people are, you know, scared came from China. All right, economic, we talk about Reaganomics, supply side economics. So what does that mean? Well, you reduce taxes, you cut taxes, and you reduce business regulation. So you cut the rules, and that's going to allow growth. And that growth is going to allow things to trickle down. So if you help the big boys, you know, back in the 20s or back in the turn of the century, we talk about Morgan and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt. You know, we don't have names quite that similar these days, but if you help the big boys out, by cutting taxes, if you help the big boys out by cutting regulation, all the spending that they make will trickle down to the middle class, to the lower classes. Jury's still out on whether that works really, really well, but he definitely deregulated banking, airlines, housing. You know, a lot of people feel like that the housing bubble burst of 2006 to 2008 was partly caused by the deregulation during the Reagan era. But you can see we are going to make this his policy. Okay, it's kind of a laissez-faire approach, but one area where we're going to spend a heck of a lot of money, we're going to spend it in defense spending because we got to win that Cold War. We got to outspend the Soviet Union. Okay. Under Bush, key episode is the increased globalization. The world is definitely catching up to the United States, and we know that now because we can see how much of a global economy we have. You know, how many times do you see something made in the U.S. as opposed to made in China or Korea or Japan or India? Or another kind of interesting moment during his presidential campaign to be reelected in 1988, he made the famous statement, "Read my lips, no new," in 1988 when he was elected, he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then after he got elected, he kind of realized, man, Reagan really didn't make a lot of money because he kept cutting taxes. And since Reagan had cut taxes, you know, Bush promised to keep them cut. Then he realized, I can't pay the bills unless we bring back some taxes. And so he had to bring back taxes, which of course is going to be used against him when he tries to run for re-election in 92. Think about Woodrow Wilson. He kept us out of war. He also was fond of using a phrase called voodoo economics, which basically meant nobody knows what the heck's going on. We're just winging this thing. And it didn't go over very well, which is why he's only a one-term president. Okay, social issues under Reagan. The number one thing was confidence. You know, Morning in America, our confidence is back, and our spending is back. You know, there's a famous nickname of the time period. People were called yuppies, young urban professionals. You know, here are these people going off to work, coming back home with his tennis racket. She's got her sneakers so she could walk fast, and these kind of businessy suits. There was a TV show in this time period called Family Ties, and one of the stars was a young actor named Michael Fox, Michael J. Fox. If you ever saw the Back to the Future movies, you saw, or Teen Wolf, you saw Michael J. Fox. Very famous TV show at its time. It was about this young family, and Michael J. Fox was a high school student who wore a tie and carried a briefcase to class. And he kept a picture of his favorite American, the Republican economic, laissez-faire president, George H.W. Bush. It was about making money. And the show was about him wanting to make money, and it was cool to make fun money. And, look at all the stuff we got here, just recognizing all about money. It was a time of spending. It was kind of like the Roaring '20s, in terms of things moving forward, etc. But there were some other things that start to happen a little differently. First, it's the first time Social Security reform is mentioned. We're starting to realize that the baby boomers are bigger than Social Security. Think about if you ever see like an anaconda or boa constrictor, those big snakes, and they swallow something, like a deer or whatever, and it's just like huge lump going through their body. That's the baby boomers. When they're first born in the 50s, that led to consumerism and all these things for kids and toys and Disney World and fast food restaurants. And in the 60s, hey, they're the protesters. They're the ones causing all the problems. In the 70s, they're the ones losing their jobs. They're the ones struggling with the economy. And in the 80s, they're spending money on their kids and getting ready to retire. And as they get closer to retirement, people realize we don't have enough money if they retire. So they actually backed up the retirement age, made it 65. And it's kind of like, you run a race and all of a sudden right before you get there, they move the finish line. So anyways, that was one big thing, the changing of Social Security. Number two is the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS crisis. There was basically it's an immune disorder where if you get AIDS, you can get HIV, or maybe it's backwards. If you get HIV, you can get AIDS. That's what it is. And HIV at first was seen as it's a homosexual thing. It's a drug addict thing. They're the only ones who get it. Then people began to realize it was being spread through blood transfusions and other things. But people freaked out a little bit. I can remember being in the locker room one morning before a scrimmage, and Magic Johnson came on TV telling everybody he had AIDS. Magic Johnson was a famous basketball player, was a LeBron James type guy, not just really, really good, but really, really popular commercials and brands and such. And he told everybody he had HIV. And people freaked out. A lot of people don't want to play basketball with him because they're worried that he was going to, rub shoulders with them and sweat on them. And, there's this whole big issue with what is HIV. And it took a long time for people to kind of come around to trying to find ways to bring medicine to bear on this. Because, again, a lot of people saw it as, not their problem. It's problems for drug addicts and homosexuals. During this time period, a public policy report came out called A Nation at Risk. We were realizing that we are falling woefully short in the classroom. If you look at our test results compared to lots of countries, we're not in the running. And that's going to change Americans' education system, and the federal government's going to get involved, and they're not going to stay out. Why do we have Common Core? Why do we have No Child Left Behind? Why do we have all these programs? Well, because the Nation at Risk realized that we needed these programs. We also had the crack epidemic. Crack cocaine is a very cheap, it's kind of like the different, buying a knockoff brand of cocaine. So cocaine was a drug of the 80s, but it had been around for a long, long time. But it was a rich person's drug. But crack was made very easily, and it was cheap. And so people started using crack, and it was highly addictive, and it became an epidemic. There was a famous moment when a basketball player, the #1 draft pick of the Boston Celtics, Len Bias, star at the University of Maryland. Everybody said he was the next Jordan. Within a couple nights after being drafted #1, he decided to have a little party, tried some crack cocaine, and it blew up his heart, and he died. That was it. Just kind of shook people up. And we had all these programs. People started saying, just say no. It was this, you'd see it in schools, you'd see it on commercials. Here's Ronald Reagan's famous actress wife, Nancy Reagan, with Super Bowl MVP, Washington Redskins quarterback Doug Williams, and it's Just Say No Day. I can remember in high school we had a Just Say No club, and people were doing what they could to combat the effects of drugs. And this is when our prisons really start to fill up, guys, because of the drug issues. Not just people selling drugs, but committing crimes so they can go buy drugs. During George H.W. Bush's presidency, we finally passed something called the Americans with Disabilities Act. Disabilities are protected. Look at the protests. Look at some of the messages. We shall overcome. That should sound familiar. Access is a civil right. Again, 14th Amendment. And this is George H.W. Bush signing into law the ADA. He also at this time signed something called the Family Medical Leave Act, which gave women guaranteed pregnancy time off, etc. Man, are we gone way away from social Darwinism. Remember the early 1900s when these people were just struggling in the factories and in the cities, and muckrakers are telling everybody to pay attention, and people are like, so, social Darwinism, racial algebra, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. All right, culture. Again, culture of the 80s, it's all about spending. A lot of people refer to it as the me generation. Madonna, I'm a material girl. All I want is my material. And it kind of had a feel of, people were focused on themselves. The first cell phone, there it is, called the brick. Music, technology, just run around playing video games. And then whatever the heck this menudo fashion is, that's Ricky Martin right there in the middle for those of you who are Ole, Ole, Ole fans. But this is the culture of the 80s. It was a technology age. It's going to be the beginning of computers, slowly but surely. Again, the first cell phones, personal computers and emails, CDs. Think about your committees of correspondence writing letters back and forth to get the American Revolution started. And here we have something radically different. And last but not least, Supreme Court. So one of the most interesting one is as Reagan and Bush appointed a lot of conservative judges of course, trying to get away from the Warren Court. Remember that very liberal. It's during this time, Bush actually called somebody a liberal at one point, and it becomes a dirty word. It's when liberal becomes an insult for some people. But they appoint lots of conservatives to try and overturn some of those liberal cases. One of them was the first woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, first woman Supreme Court justice. Pretty soon thereafter, we'll see Thurgood Marshall become the first black Supreme Court justice. Maybe an important case during the time period, 1989, Texas versus Johnson. And you can see what this is about. Is it constitutional to burn the flag? It's such a great question. Is it illegal to burn the flag? Should it be illegal to burn the flag? And people have very conflicting opinions on this. No, we should not burn the flag. It stands for so many powerful things. So many veterans have died, and defending this flag, we should treat it with honor and respect at all times. And then some people say, well, what does the flag stand for? Well, the flag stands for freedom. America's all about freedom. And they say, well, then I should be free to burn the flag. Kind of goes back and forth. But very interesting. We see a lot of protest speech, Supreme Court case popping up, from the Vietnam War forward. Tinker versus Des Moines was another one in the 70s where a girl wanted to wear a black armband to school to protest the war, and she was suspended. She's like, nah, civil rights, buddy. They're First Amendment freedoms. And the Supreme Court agreed with her. So that wraps up the 80s. Morning in America.